Welcome to Reddit Saga. If you're a fan of heartfelt, real-life stories, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss out. Thanks for being here. Let's dive into today's story.
It was supposed to be a quiet Christmas dinner, just family, warm lights, and that performative kind of love we always fake so well. The house smelled like pine candles and roasted ham, the fireplace flickered like it was trying too hard to be cozy, and my father, Douglas Green, was doing what he always did best, pretending. Pretending to be the generous patriarch, the smiling man who poured wine and told jokes too loud. And everyone laughed. Everyone played their part. I sat at the edge of the table, next to Mom, watching her flinch every time he touched her shoulder. Her smile was stretched too thin. She kept brushing her necklace, the one he gave her 2 years ago after one of his outbursts. A peace offering, that's what he called it. I called it a collar. The clinking of glasses silenced the room as my cousin tapped her fork against hers. "Let's go around and share what we're grateful for," she chirped, all bright-eyed and oblivious. I felt Mom stiffen beside me. I knew she dreaded these moments. The public performance of gratitude always reminded her of what she had to fake. One by one, the family took turns. Grateful for health. Grateful for promotions. Grateful for Dad's generosity. Of course. When it was my turn, I felt heat crawl up my throat. Everyone's eyes were on me. Dad's smile curled, expectant. Controlling. Waiting. I looked at my mother instead. Her eyes were wet. She blinked fast. That was all it took. That tiny tremble in her hands. That invisible scream behind her polite nod. And something inside me snapped. "I'm grateful," I said slowly. "That Mom gets to smile, for real, when Dad's not around." A silence dropped over the table like a bomb. Forks froze mid-air. Someone coughed awkwardly. But I didn't stop. "I'm grateful she doesn't have to flinch anymore. That I'm old enough to understand what those bruises really were. That she doesn't have to keep pretending for this family's comfort." My voice shook, but it didn't break. Across the table, Dad's face shifted. The warmth drained from his features like someone had pulled a plug. He stood up so fast his chair crashed backward. "What did you just say?" His voice was sharp, serrated. I stood too. "You heard me." He lunged. It wasn't dramatic like in the movies. No slow motion, no gasps. Just the sharp thud of his fists on the table as he tried to reach me, knocking glasses over. My cousin screamed. My uncle grabbed him. My younger brother, James, jumped between us. "Stop! Dad, stop!" James shouted, shoving him back. But Dad's eyes were wild. "You ungrateful little brat! You don't talk about this family like that." "This family?" I barked, heart racing. "You mean the one you ruled like a tyrant? The one Mom had to survive in silence?" Mom was crying now. Not the quiet, controlled kind. The ugly, gasping sobs she used to hide behind closed doors. My aunt pulled her into a hug. "She's upset, Eliza, just stop." "Stop?" I laughed, bitter and loud. "You've all been stopping for years. Stopping your ears. Your mouths. Your conscience." Dad tried to break past James again, but someone grabbed his arm. I couldn't see who. My pulse was pounding in my ears. My hands were shaking, but I didn't move. I stood there like I had armor made of every night I'd heard Mom cry through the walls. Every lie I'd swallowed. Every time I saw her cover a bruise with makeup and smile through the pain. The room was chaos. But in the middle of it, I felt something strange. Peace. Because for the first time, the truth wasn't a ghost in my chest. I had released it. I had dared to speak. Dad was finally dragged into the other room by 2 of my uncles. James stood in front of me like a shield, his chest rising and falling fast. Mom reached for my hand. Her fingers were ice cold. She whispered, "You didn't have to do that." "I did," I said, eyes burning. "Someone had to." That night, I drove home alone. Snow fell quietly on the windshield, muffling the world like a blanket. I should have felt scared. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel. I knew what kind of man he was. I knew what he was capable of. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because silence didn't protect anyone. It only prolonged the damage. And I had just broken the cycle. Even if it broke the family with it. The next morning, my phone was a battlefield. 37 missed calls, 24 text messages, and 1 very long voicemail from Aunt Teresa begging me to apologize. For the sake of peace. James messaged me only 2 words, "You okay?" The rest of the family? They wanted me silent. Again. I went to work like nothing happened. Sat at my desk in the law office, filed motions, reviewed depositions, answered emails. But my mind wasn't in it. Every time I blinked, I saw Dad's face, twisted, red, not just angry, but exposed. I heard my mother's sobs, not the silent ones I'd grown up with, but raw and open like something had finally cracked. And I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. That night I called Mom. She picked up after 5 rings. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't split down the middle. Her voice was too calm. Too even. "You don't have to act okay," I said. "I'm fine, Eliza. You weren't fine last night." A long pause. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me what happened. Years ago. All of it." She sighed. "It's over." "Is it?" Another pause. "I stayed because of you," she said quietly. "I didn't want to destroy your childhood." "You didn't destroy anything." "He did." My throat tightened. "And I remember more than you think." There was silence on the other end. Then she hung up. It hurt, but it also told me I was right. There was more. More than just what I remembered from behind bedroom doors or hushed fights through the walls. I needed facts. Something concrete. Not just for myself, but for her. For the truth she'd buried under years of survival. So I went digging. I started with old records. I had access to public court archives through the firm, and I used it. There was no report filed against my father. No restraining orders. Nothing. He'd made sure of that. But then I looked at medical records, under my mother's name. A few were sealed, but one stood out. A hospital visit from 2009, fractured wrist, contusions to the ribs, accidental fall, noted. She'd signed off on that. I remembered that winter. She'd said she slipped on the icy stairs. But I also remembered her walking with a limp, flinching when Dad reached for her plate at dinner. I printed what I could. Highlighted timelines. Created a folder. I didn't even know what for, maybe validation. Maybe to remind myself I wasn't crazy. That silence didn't mean innocence. I also visited Doris, the neighbor we lived next to before we moved to the new house. She was in her 80s now, sharp as a tack. "Oh, honey," she said when I showed up at her door. "I was wondering when one of you would come back." We sat in her living room, tea in hand, surrounded by doilies and faded photos. "You used to knock on my door in the middle of the night," she told me gently. "Always holding your little stuffed rabbit. Asking if your mommy could come sleep too." I blinked. "I did. You were maybe 6. Your mother would come over with a bruise blooming on her cheek and say she fell into the pantry." Doris sipped her tea. "I never believed her. But she never stayed more than a few hours. Said she had to get back before he woke up." I swallowed. "Why didn't you call the police?" I asked her the same thing once. She said, "If I do, it'll get worse." "For me. For Eliza." Doris looked at me gently. She thought silence was protection. I left with a pit in my stomach. My mom hadn't just endured, she'd calculated her suffering to shield me. And yet all these years, I'd thought her quiet was complicity. That she'd accepted his cruelty. But the truth was crueler. She had sacrificed her own freedom so I wouldn't lose mine. Back home, I opened the drawer in my nightstand and pulled out an old composition notebook. I'd kept it since I was 13. A journal, full of things I never told anyone. I flipped through it, and there it was. April 3rd, Mom had a black eye. Said it was makeup. I think she lied. June 22nd, heard yelling. Then a thud. Then silence. I pretended to sleep. August 9th, I hate how he hugs me like nothing happened. I cried. Harder than I had in years. Because that girl was me. And she deserved the truth too. The next day, I brought everything, the hospital printouts, journal pages, Doris's written statement, to someone I trusted, Sarah, one of the senior attorneys in the family law division. She looked through it slowly, her expression unreadable. "This is substantial," she said finally. "But you don't have a smoking gun." "Not yet." "I don't want to sue him," I said. "I want to expose him. I want people to see who he really is." Sarah nodded slowly. "Then you'll need corroboration. Patterns. Other voices." And that's when it clicked. My dad had worked in corporate consulting for over 2 decades. He had power. He had interns. Assistants. Employees who, like my mother, may have swallowed the truth to survive. So I reached out. Quietly. Carefully. Through LinkedIn. Through old emails. Some never responded. Some said they didn't want to get involved. But one did. Her name was Claire. She had worked as his executive assistant for 4 years. "I thought I was crazy," Claire said during our Zoom call. "He used to make me stay late, then tell me I was lucky to be mentored by someone like him. He'd brush against me, ask questions that weren't professional. Did you ever file anything?" I tried. HR swept it under the rug. Said I misread things? He made sure I got reassigned. She still had copies of emails. Inappropriate ones. Vaguely threatening ones. And a journal like mine. The same exact pattern. We weren't isolated incidents. We were chapters in a story he had authored for decades, one of intimidation, silence, and manipulation. That weekend, I made a decision. I recorded a podcast episode under an anonymous name. Titled it, "The Things We Don't Say at Christmas." I told the whole story. Changed names. Changed dates. But the pain? That stayed real. I thought no one would listen. But 3 days later, the episode had over 50,000 plays. And a message landed in my inbox. It was from a journalist at the Herald. She wrote, "I think I know who your story is about. And I think it's time the truth had a name." When the article dropped, I was sitting in my parked car outside the courthouse. It was raining, a soft, persistent drizzle that smeared the world into gray. The headline on my screen hit like a hammer. Green family legacy tarnished, domestic abuse allegations surface amid public silence. Underneath, a photo of my father in a crisp suit, smiling like a man who still thought he owned the narrative. He didn't. Not anymore. The story referenced anonymous sources, documented patterns of behavior spanning decades, and one family member's courageous decision to speak out. They didn't name me, but everyone knew. My inbox exploded. So did my voicemails. Some messages were cruel. Some were kind. A few were threatening. But most said the same thing: "Thank you for speaking." My father didn't respond right away. Neither did his campaign team. But 2 days later, his lawyer released a statement. "Mr. Green has always upheld the highest standards in his personal and professional life. These recent stories are distortions fueled by personal grievances. While Mr. Green acknowledges that he has struggled with anger in the past, he has never harmed anyone intentionally." Anger. That was the word he chose. Like rage was a stub toe. Like it hadn't hollowed out my mother from the inside for 20 years. I sat in my apartment, rereading the statement, shaking. Then I got up, grabbed the folder, the one I'd been building for weeks, and took a train to meet Claire. She had printed copies of every email. Highlighted. Annotated. And she wasn't the only one anymore. After the article went live, 2 other women reached out, both former employees, both with eerily similar stories. "He called it mentorship," one said. "But it was always conditional. He made me believe I owed him something for my success," said another. Patterns. Echoes. A web he thought no one would untangle. We filed an internal complaint through the ethics board at the firm he once consulted for. Then we forwarded copies to the Attorney General's office. Claire and the other women agreed to go on record, under their own names. I still hadn't. Not yet. I wasn't sure if it was cowardice or strategy. But something in me said, wait. The fallout was slow but certain. He lost his advisory role within a week. Corporate clients began distancing themselves. Donors to his campaign pulled out quietly. No one made a big show of it, but the tide had shifted. He was no longer the man with the Midas touch. He was toxic. Then came the podcast. A journalist named Ava reached out. She hosted a series called Legacy and Lies and asked if I'd be willing to share my side. I hesitated. But something told me it was time. We recorded it over 2 sessions. She let me speak. Really speak. About the way the silence used to choke me. About the nights I'd sit outside my mother's locked door, listening to the muffled sobs, too afraid to knock. About the way my father would emerge from the hallway like nothing happened, humming, smiling, asking what I wanted for breakfast. You were raised in the shadow of that violence, Ava said. And yet you're the one holding the light now. It felt strange, beautiful and terrible, to be seen. The podcast went viral. It reached not just our town, not just our state, but people across the country. Survivors wrote in, saying it gave them courage. Daughters, mothers, even sons. One message from a woman in Idaho read, I left him after 12 years. Because of your voice. But not all voices were supportive. Some of my extended family turned cold. My Uncle Mark called me a disgrace. My cousin unfollowed me and posted something about family loyalty. They acted like I was the traitor, not the man who terrorized his wife and children behind closed doors for decades. And then there was my brother. James called me one night, silent for a long time before saying, He's blaming everything on you. Of course he is, I said. He's never blamed himself for anything. He says it was just anger. I laughed bitterly. Yeah. Like rain is just water falling. Doesn't mean it won't drown you. James was quiet. I didn't know it was this bad. You did, I said gently. You just didn't want to see it. A week later, James posted a photo of us as kids. No caption. But it said more than anything. Meanwhile, my mother was changing. At first, she was wary. Quiet. But one afternoon, I stopped by her house, and she was in the garden, humming. I hadn't heard her hum in years. She looked up and said, "You always told me you hated this place. I hated how it made you feel small." I said, "Well," she said, straightening, "it doesn't anymore." That day, she handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a letter, her own written statement. She wanted it published. She wanted her voice added to mine. "I'm not ashamed anymore," she said. "And I'm not afraid of him." I cried in her kitchen, more overwhelmed by pride than sorrow. With her permission, the journalist released her statement in a follow-up piece. It described years of control, manipulation, verbal degradation, and the slow erosion of her self-worth. She didn't frame herself as a victim, she framed herself as someone reclaiming her life. The media firestorm was immediate. My father held a press conference. I watched it on my laptop, heart pounding, hands cold. He stood at a podium, flanked by two advisors, wearing his signature navy suit and that politician's half-smile. "I want to speak to the recent allegations," he began. "I have made mistakes in my life. I have said things I regret, raised my voice in anger. But I have never intentionally harmed anyone, and I deeply resent the narrative being constructed about me." He looked straight into the camera. "This is not about abuse. This is about resentment. My daughter has chosen to misrepresent the past to rewrite her present." And there it was, the final, desperate grasp at control. To paint me as bitter, as vindictive, as unstable. But the world had already moved on. The comments section told a different story. People weren't buying it. They saw through him. The tone-deaf apology. The sidestepping of accountability. The gaslighting. Later that week, the district attorney announced an official inquiry into his past conduct, both personal and professional. Subpoenas were issued. Depositions scheduled. His house of cards was trembling. One morning, I received a letter. A real one. Handwritten. It was from a girl named Lily. She was 15. Her father was violent. Her mother was scared. She wrote, "I played your podcast for my mom. She packed our bags last night. We're staying with my aunt now. I think we're going to be okay." I read it 3 times before I could breathe again. That's when I knew I wasn't just burning down a lie. I was lighting a path. My father tried to call me. I didn't answer. He sent a message. "You're destroying everything." And I replied, "No. I'm just refusing to protect the rot anymore." They say patterns are just coincidences repeated. But I know better. Patterns are choices. Choices you defend, deny, disguise. He called it anger. I called it abuse. He said it was a phase. I called it a history. And now, I call it exposed. There was no single moment when everything changed. No dramatic courtroom showdown or slamming of iron bars. Just quiet shifts, like the slow turn of a tide. My father didn't get arrested, not yet. The investigation was ongoing, entangled in the slow machinery of bureaucracy and influence. But he was no longer the man he had carefully constructed in the public eye. The invitations stopped. The meetings got cancelled. His name, once spoken with respect, became a cautionary tale. He wasn't a pillar anymore. He was a warning. Meanwhile, I was learning how to breathe again. I walked into the grocery store one afternoon, and wasn't afraid of running into someone who knew the family. I didn't avoid eye contact with neighbors. I didn't shrink when someone mentioned Christmas. For the first time in my adult life, I felt tall in my own skin. The podcast continued. After the first 2 episodes, the response was overwhelming. So many stories. So many people who had grown up inside homes that looked perfect from the outside. People who, like me, had mistaken survival for peace. I interviewed some of them. Others just listened. But the message was always the same: you're not alone, and you're not crazy. And through it all, my mother was changing too. She started therapy. It was awkward at first. She didn't know how to talk about herself without apologizing. But week by week, she got stronger. I'd catch her humming while cooking, laughing at shows she used to call silly, planting herbs in pots along her windowsill. Little rebellions of joy. Proof that healing didn't always arrive with fireworks. It could come quietly, like sunlight through a window you forgot you opened. We started spending Sundays together. Not out of obligation, but because we wanted to. Sometimes we talked about the past. Sometimes we didn't. Sometimes we just sat in silence with a cup of tea between us, and it felt more powerful than any conversation. One Sunday, she said something that stayed with me. "You didn't just free me, Eliza. You freed the part of me that stopped believing I could ever be heard. I didn't have a response. I just reached for her hand. A few weeks later, I got invited to speak at a conference on advocacy and domestic abuse. It wasn't something I had planned for. I was still just a paralegal. Still someone figuring herself out. But I said yes. Because if I could stand up in a room full of strangers and tell them what I once whispered only to a journal, then maybe someone else in that room would feel brave enough to whisper it out loud too. I wore a simple black dress. No frills. No jewelry. I wanted to look like myself, not someone who had overcome, but someone still standing. The room was packed. Mostly women, some men. All watching. I spoke about memory. About shame. About how silence becomes a second skin, and how peeling it off feels like shedding your own name. And then I said, my father didn't need a weapon. His words were enough. His silence. His disapproval. His control. That's the thing about emotional violence. It doesn't leave bruises you can photograph. But it rewires you. Teaches you to flinch at love. To mistrust safety. To silence yourself before anyone else can. When I finished, no one clapped at first. Just a stillness. The kind that happens when people are holding their breath. Then, like a wave, the applause came. Not loud. But honest. Afterward, a woman approached me in the hallway. Middle-aged, nervous smile. You're Eliza, she said. Yes. I used to work for your father. Years ago. I left after 2 months. Thought it was my fault. But hearing you tonight. She trailed off, her eyes brimming. It wasn't me. It never was, I said. She hugged me. It wasn't long. But it was enough. And then, months later, the letter came. It was from the board overseeing my father's advisory positions, corporate, academic, nonprofit. The letter confirmed his removal from all standing boards and recommended a permanent ban from any leadership or mentorship roles in their networks. They cited a pattern of misconduct inconsistent with our values. There it was. On paper. Proof. He didn't respond publicly. Not this time. No statements. No camera-ready apology. Just silence. A different kind of silence. James called me the next day. He's leaving town, he said. Where? Somewhere in Florida, I think. Bought a small place. He's not well. I stayed quiet. You're not going to say anything? I thought about it. Thought about how many years I'd wished for this, some fall from grace, some karmic thunderbolt. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like relief. I don't need him to be punished, I said slowly. I just needed him to stop pretending he was something he wasn't. James sighed. He still thinks he did nothing wrong. Of course he does. That's why this had to happen. I'm proud of you, you know. That caught me off guard. Really? Yeah. You broke the cycle. I don't know how you did it, but I'm glad you did. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had a brother again. It wasn't a clean ending. There were still days when the memories clawed back. When I'd hear someone raise their voice and feel my stomach flip. When guilt would sneak in like a shadow, whispering that I'd broken something sacred. But then I'd remember, what I broke wasn't sacred. It was silence. And silence was never holy. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of the old family house. Just looking. It was smaller than I remembered. Less imposing. The shutters were fading, the yard a little overgrown. I didn't go inside. Didn't need to. I just stood there, breathing. And then I turned and walked away. Not because I was running. But because I was done standing still. I had spent so long living beneath someone else's version of the truth. So long whispering to survive. But not anymore. He lost control the moment I stopped handing it to him. And I gained something better than peace. I gained my voice. Sometimes, the loudest thing in a family isn't shouting, it's the silence. It's the quiet agreements not to speak, the subtle looks across dinner tables that tell you to drop it, the half-smiles people wear like masks. Eliza's story reminds us that truth doesn't die in the face of violence, it only gets buried. And one day, if someone is brave enough, it rises. What we witnessed through Eliza's journey was not just the unraveling of a family secret, it was the reclaiming of a voice that had been stifled for years. Her courage to speak out against her father's abuse wasn't an act of vengeance. It was an act of healing. Not just for herself, but for her mother, for the women who had endured his behavior in silence, and for the people listening in their own quiet suffering, wondering if their stories mattered. There's a powerful lesson in that: truth is contagious. When one person speaks it, it gives others permission to do the same. Eliza didn't set out to be a hero. She was scared. She was unsure. But she knew what she saw. What she lived. and she refused to rewrite her memories just to make everyone else more comfortable. That's something many of us struggle with, especially in families. We're told to forgive and forget. To move on, even when no one has ever apologized. To be the bigger person. But being the bigger person doesn't mean carrying the weight of everyone else's denial. Sometimes it means putting it down and walking away. Eliza didn't burn her family down for drama or attention. She didn't shout to be right. She simply stopped lying. She stopped agreeing to silence. And in doing so, she forced the people around her to confront what they had ignored for too long. Another important lesson from her story is that abuse doesn't always wear a visible face. Her father didn't always raise his fists. Sometimes he raised his voice. Sometimes he didn't say anything at all, but made his presence so cold, so threatening, that it bent everyone else around him. That's what emotional abuse does. It distorts your sense of normal. It teaches you to anticipate danger even in peace. And when no one acknowledges it, it makes you question your sanity. That's why Eliza's refusal to stay silent mattered so much. She gave her pain a name. She gave her memories a platform. And she gave her mother a chance to stop pretending. Sometimes, the most powerful act of love is telling the truth, even when it shakes the foundation you stand on. There's also a broader lesson here, about legacy. Her father tried to build a perfect image, generous, respected, influential. But the people closest to him knew another man. The one who used his anger like a currency. Who wore power like armor. And who believed he could control the narrative forever. He was wrong. Because legacy isn't what you say about yourself, it's what people say about you when you're not in the room. It's the memories you leave behind in others. And no PR campaign, no press conference, can erase the harm you've done when enough people are willing to speak. Eliza redefined her family's legacy. Not by pretending it was whole, but by acknowledging where it was broken. And in doing so, she didn't just expose her father's pattern, she ended it. That's what breaking cycles looks like. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's one hard conversation. One refusal to pretend. One step into truth. For those watching her story and wondering, could I ever do that? The answer is yes. But it doesn't have to be public. It doesn't have to be loud. Telling the truth can be quiet. Private. Just you and someone you trust. What matters is that you don't lie to yourself anymore. You don't owe silence to the people who hurt you. You don't owe comfort to those who demand your loyalty while denying your pain. And most importantly, you don't need to wait for permission to start healing. Eliza's story is proof that the moment you reclaim your voice, everything shifts. You may lose people. You may be called difficult, dramatic, ungrateful. But what you gain is something far more valuable: freedom. Integrity. Peace that isn't built on pretending. So if there's one lesson to hold on to, it's this. Your voice matters, even when it shakes. Especially when it shakes. Speak it. Someone is waiting to hear it.